Let's talk about composition. I'm going to come at this from the perspective of comic books because that's what I'm competent at, but all art uses composition and most of this can just be generalized. If you were to look for composition on the internet, you'll find a lot of videos talking about things you can do to have a better composition. Here's your 8,000th video about using the rule of thirds. Surely, if you do everything on a tic-tac-toe grid, your art will be good forever and you'll win all the awards. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with these kinds of tools, these kinds of videos that teach you techniques, but they aren't composition. They're tools you use while composing. It's sort of like teaching you how to tweak your car's engine, but never teaching you how to drive. I figure we could go over the most basic thing about composition that doesn't really get a lot of press, and that's what it is. Because the point of composition is not to look good. It's never been to look good. You see, it's a truism, but all art is there to make some kind of statement. Whether it's a picture of a beautiful sunset, or a song about a guy with no wife, or even just a panel in a comic that's supposed to let you know that the hero knows that the villain knows that the hero knows something. All art has a point. It's trying to communicate something. Composition is how you do that. If you have a photograph of a sunset and it's not composed, then you have a photograph which shows a sunset. But if you compose it, you can have a photograph that reminds you of that time you spent on the beach with your wife, or that time in your childhood and you're nostalgic for it, or the last sunset ever just before magic vanishes from the world. The same fundamental photograph composed differently can evoke very different ideas. And that's what composition is. Composition is what lets an image do its job. You do have to figure out what your image's job is before you can even start to compose, but after that it's just a matter of putting together anything you can think of to make your image communicate better. That's what composition is. And all of those tools about rules of thirds and stuff like that, those are just tools to help your impact increase. But if you don't know what impact you're trying to do, they're not going to help. Let's give some examples. Start with a bad one, as usual. This is from a generic isekai manga. Isekai manga are astonishingly poorly composed, and that's because they have to put out 8,000 panels every nanosecond to keep up with demand. They're usually well drawn, but not very well composed. Here's a great example. This has so many composition problems that it's actually worse than uncomposed. It's negatively composed. Obviously, some of these composition problems are simply implementation. For example, we've got this MC Escher door thing here. We've got this weird overlap. But fundamentally, the problem here isn't in the implementation of any given detail. It's in the fact that none of the elements of this composition sell what this is about. The point of this panel is that one of your isekai waifus has brought back a piece of paper that says you're free to go on a vacation for a week, or whatever, right? But nothing about this composition really sells the idea that this is something that you're looking forward to. This is now a source of freedom, and she's happy about it, and you're happy about it, and everything's going to happen great. None of this sells any of that. Now, what kind of composition would work? Well, there's a lot of ideas that you can use. Basically, anything you can think of that might improve your composition probably will improve your composition because you thought of it and you also thought of the image's main point. So in your mind, those things are connected, and therefore there is some kind of way to help those connections come out. Just as an example, this uses a ton of vertical lines, like here, and here, and here, and here, and here. It's a very vertical setup, but vertical lines generally don't communicate freedom very well. They're just exactly the opposite of that. So normally speaking, you wouldn't use vertical lines in this. If you do, that's fine. But if you think about lines, you would immediately think, oh, I don't want vertical ones, I want round ones or horizontal ones or something like that. Similarly, there is the number of things that are in the image, the number of props. This guy and his spear does not speak about freedom. What they probably wanted to indicate was this was some kind of government office, but instead of putting up a sign or something that was hard to draw, they just stapled in a generic character that they drew months before and had on a background that could be excised and then stapled in. a lot of other things would have been better. For example, people coming out of that door that were carrying backpacks or something to indicate they're leaving, or children running around in the foreground, or literally anything besides a guard. The basic idea here is that when you know what your image is trying to communicate, you just need to think about how to make it communicate better. That means the tone, the emotional content, the ideas, all of that stuff has to come through as clearly as possible. And in this case, it just didn't. They didn't do any composing. So they ended up with garbage. Let's go over a couple of better ones. I think that if you wanted to learn composition, the best comic you could look at would be Hellboy. Hellboy uses very simple composition, but it always works. They are masters. So in this case, for example, we've got Hellboy towering over a ghoul, and it's a comedy beat. The ghoul has lost his arm, and he's complaining about it in a very ghoul way. But in order to compose this, they clearly wanted to indicate that Hellboy was the overpowering bully in this situation. So they've got Hellboy towering over, looking huge, and they've got the ghoul looking limpy and weak. And one of the things that they do a lot that really works in Hellboy is the characters are almost always very close, interacting. This really helps to sell whatever the theme is of whatever image you're using. If Hellboy was standing on one side of the frame and the ghoul was standing on the other side of the frame and they were just talking over the gap, the impact wouldn't be as good. You wouldn't really get the feeling like Hellboy is big and in charge. In addition, the art of this series is mostly blacks. Like, this usually one kind of light gradient and then black. And that's exactly what we've got here. The ghoul is white and black, and Hellboy is red and black, and his coat is gray and black. But black is a very unforgiving color, because if you put black against black, you can't see shit. So if this down here was black, this would be invisible. These would be invisible. So knowing that, they made the bottom half of the image gray, so you could see it. But we all know that Hellboy's head holds up very well. This profile is iconic, so it can be in the black. We don't have to see the back of Hellboy's head clearly. So they made the top of the frame black. And that simple cut right across the middle, black on top, gray on bottom, really sells the whole composition of Hellboy towering over him. This isn't something that you always do. This isn't something that you always think about. It's something that comes out of having ideas about how you want to communicate this better and having some constraints where you have to do certain things. Like make your characters out of mostly black ink. And that's really going to always be at the heart of composition. We need the image to be able to do its job, so it has to look okay so you can see it. It also has to communicate what it's trying to say, so we've got Hellboy towering over it. That sort of stuff, right? Here's another Hellboy example. I really love Hellboy's compositions, if I haven't made that clear, and this is a fantastic idea of the simplest possible composition. Because the thing about composition is it doesn't add more lines. It doesn't make your art more complicated to render. All it does is use the lines you're using to make better art. And this is a fantastic example of this. The point of this panel is that Hellboy and his companion have just gone through some shit, and they're reacting to it differently. Hellboy has already gone through this shit plenty, and he's just sort of escorting this lady through, and she hasn't gone through this shit, and she's definitely feeling it. The focus of this is mostly on the new guy, the new character, because you can see that she's the one who's got the face full of frame. Her face is the lightest part of the image. People are going to notice her pretty quick. Hellboy is there for sure, but this image is about the fact that she is reacting, like a newbie, not the fact that Hellboy isn't. In this case, Hellboy is providing support, and you can tell that by the way that they have very carefully made this character pop. They also sell the idea by having Hellboy looking off at the horizon because he's seen this a million times, and she's looking down into the side because they're not looking in the same direction and she's still processing things. Similarly, the characters are very close together. They're physically close because they are working together, they're on the same side, they're working towards the same goals. Even though at the moment they're not on the same page, they're still allies and they're still very close. So the characters are drawn physically overlapping and casually friendly with each other like this. If they were, a mile apart with some white space between them, we would sense that Hellboy and this character were going to have some distance between them because of this difference. But because they're overlapping, this difference is minimized, and we're led to understand that she's going to get over it. There's also some compositional stuff going on, like the fact that her face is so pale really requires it to be framed in black. So that's why her hair and the side of her face is just plain old black. And you see this all the time. If you've got a pale face, you want that pale face to pop so people actually really can see it. This sort of compositional stuff is just a bunch of ideas that you have when you're trying to do composition, which is why looking up things like the three-quarter or the thirds rule or things like that, value studies, all of that is valuable. But it's not composing. Composing is putting that stuff to work on purpose to sell whatever the image is trying to sell better. So let's talk about some more. Here's a Mobius image. Mobius's compositions are usually fantastic, and this is no exception. There's a lot about this image that I really enjoy, but the reason that I put it in here specifically is because of the very gentle way that he frames this face. As I said before, if you've got a face, usually you're going to want to make it pop because it's the thing that humans identify with. But in this case, the face is mostly hidden, and it's very small in the image, so how do you make it pop? And the answer is, you put some kind of block around it. In this case, we've got this giant white marshmallow kind of pointing to the face, surrounding the face. So the face still draws your attention, even though it's small, and it feels insignificant compared to the giant white robot bird, but it's the eye gets drawn. The eye gets pulled into that face. Of course, you then move on to look at the rest of the stuff going on, and it's arrayed in a nice loop so that you can really take it in a sweep. All of this stuff is stuff that Mobius used a lot. He was big into drawing the eye around the frame, and that's exactly what we've got here. We've got a lot of these elements that draw in a nice line, but he never forgets to focus on the thing you're supposed to focus on, which in this case is that nice bright face. He also uses some secondary stuff like bounce light to make sure that we get a distinction from the bird and the ground rather than them kind of merging together into a blob. These are all technical things that you learn as you go. You don't have to know these things. You don't have to consider them for every single image you make. They're things that come naturally over time as you start to refine your process. Here's another Mobius example. This one I really enjoy because of the colors. You can see that we've got these warm tones contrasting very nicely with these really solid, cool tones, and this combines very well to make it feel mundane, like a golden hour picture of someone having, dinner on the canals in Venice or something. Sometimes you don't need very many compositional elements. Sometimes you only need a couple of compositional elements, and then the rest of it just has to magnify those elements. In this case, the blue and the orange lock this image together so well that we don't need to have a lot of things like, rule of thirds or, whatever else we're trying to do. We can rely very heavily on the color scheme and just a little bit of pop, like the green right here, to really sell this calming evening image of a weird alien world that doesn't make any sense to us, but it makes perfect sense to us because we've all been here before. The colors say so. Here's another example. Even if you're just drawing a character, you can compose it so the character really hits. And this is very important to me. I find that especially with something like isekai manga, they'll do a lot of close-ups of characters, but they'll never be composed in a way that makes the characters have impact. Those characters not only don't look good, but they don't leave any impression on you. But if you're using composition, you can arrange the close-up however you want, and you can leave very powerful impressions just by knowing how to compose the image. Now, a lot of character composition is also going to be reliant on costuming and stuff, which happens most of the time before a comic book panel, but the same basic philosophy applies. For example, this character has a very dark face in comparison to the rest of her clothes and stuff. But her face still pops because of the tonal contrast, the color contrast, between the blue and the orange. Then she's got some echoing orange down here to really help to make sure that we don't feel like, her face is the only thing in the image that works at all. This incredibly bright costume really helps to sell her presence as something that exists, as something that is out of the norm for this. If she was colored in a darker blue costume, she would feel like a laborer or someone else who's, just kind of stuck there for the day and having to do their job. But because she's in this pristine white clothing and the background is so dark, she shines in a very literal sense. She's also carrying around this doohickey, which has a lot of fun colors attached to it. That also helps her to shine. Anything you can do to make your character pop will make your character pop. It's kind of obvious, right? But these are like a whole bunch of various little techniques that you use, and you combine whichever ones you can think of, and you make better art. So her dark face is framed in white to make it pop, and she's holding something cool to make it pop. She's got some debris down here to make the image have some depth to make it pop. She's got some orange over here to make it pop. Her feet come down, and you notice her boots are quite dark, so in order to make the boots pop, what do? We add some gold piping, and we arbitrarily brighten up the ground at her boots so that they're not the same value as the background. Gotta make it pop. Gotta make her have presence. And of course, it's not all about popping, it's also about the emotional impact. She's got some very alien things going on. She's got this weird hat, which is kind of a Mobius standard. She's got these weird sigils. She's got an inexplicable Starbucks. So we're left wondering who this person is and having this feeling of unreality, but it's all normal to her, right? The image tries to communicate something, and the composition is what helps you to communicate that. Whether it's because it hits your eye faster and harder, or whether it's because it helps to sell the tone, whatever you're trying to do, you use composition to do it. Let's go over another one here. She-Dwarf is a more contemporary example. I recommend this comic because every single panel is about selling what's in the panel rather than about displaying what's in the panel. In this case, in most cases in She-Dwarf, what happens is that they just find one keystone compositional element and then put together the rest kind of whatever feels right. And that's not bad, because comics move fast and you kind of need to get things done as an artist. You can't spend hours agonizing over the composition of every panel. So they usually find one compositional element, whether it's a fun camera angle or a fun color idea or something like that, and they go with it. In this case, what they've done is they've very clearly differentiated between the foreground and the background using a simple fade out. They fade to blue in the background, so we've got a very misty, far-off background in comparison to the really rugged and present foreground. This really gives us a feeling like she's going to progress. She's going off into the distance, into this town, and she's enjoying herself. She's got all these little clouds of smoke and stuff coming off. It's a very simple technique. You don't need to use every compositional technique that has ever existed in every picture. Just using one or two will usually be enough to punch that image into the reader's head and make sure they understand what that is trying to do. What is this panel trying to communicate? It could not be clearer. She's found herself a fun new town, and she's going to go in. But that is helped so much by the fact that the town is grayed out, and she is bold. Alright, let's do one more example, because a panel in a comic is not always a solo thing. Usually panels come in packs like this. In this case, we have 3 panels that have almost identical layouts. The composition is fundamentally very similar. And that's because of the joke that the artist wants to tell. If this panel and this panel were composed differently, it would take the brain too long to figure out what happened. We would have to fill in the gap with a picture of the rat creatures jumping or something. But it's much funnier if they have the exact same layout and you just flick them across the space, and because they're the only things that have changed, the audience immediately understands what happened. This joke only works because of the composition between the panels. Oftentimes, you'll read, how do I do better panel compositions? And it'll be like, oh, you can use like diagonal panels, and you can use panels that have breakouts, and you can do all this stuff, and put in some splash panels, and use some big panels, and use some small panels. But at the end of the day, the continuity between the panels helps to sell whatever the page is trying to tell you. Because the page also has a job. The page also has a point. And those panels are going to help to sell that as well. The composition between the panels is exactly as important as the composition within the panels for most comics. And again, this isn't something where there are rules that you must follow. Every rule you can find, every tool you can use, including all of these, they're just things that you might want to think about to help you tell whatever you're trying to tell. And if one of them seems to be the right fit, well, guess what? It is the right fit because you came up with the idea and you had the idea on how to punch it up. So your brain obviously knows how you want to punch it up with that idea. And if something feels like a bad idea, then your brain probably won't be able to use it to punch it up because it can't figure out, it doesn't have any purchase there. This is the most basic thing about composition, and I really wanted to make just a little video about the idea of composition. Understand what your image is trying to communicate, and make sure that your composition communicates that better. Whether it's because you understand how to use gaps in order to sell and frame characters so the eye can follow them, or whether that's by doing things like using the same composition 3 times to sell a joke, or whether it's by using colors, or tone values, or the rule of thirds, or whatever else you can think of. Over time, you can pick up more and more tools to help you sell your compositions better. But you can start with no tools at all, because understanding what you want to say is the most critical part. See you around.